A kitchen is a room or part of a room used for cooking and food preparation in a dwelling or in a commercial establishment. In the West, a modern residential kitchen is typically equipped with a stove, a sink with hot and cold running water, a refrigerator, counters and kitchen cabinets arranged according to a modular design. Many households have a microwave oven, a dishwasher and other electric appliances. The main function of a kitchen is serving as a location for storing, cooking and preparing food, but it may also be used for dining, entertaining and laundry. Commercial kitchens are found in restaurants, cafeterias, hotels, hospitals, educational and workplace facilities, army barracks, and similar establishments. These kitchens are generally larger and equipped with bigger and more heavy-duty equipment than a residential kitchen. For example, a large restaurant may have a huge walk-in refrigerator and a large commercial dishwasher machine. Commercial kitchens are generally subject to public health laws. They are inspected periodically by public health officials, and forced to close if they do not meet hygienic requirements mandated by law. History. The evolution of the kitchen is linked to the invention of the cooking range stove, and the development of water infrastructure capable of supplying running water to private homes. Food was cooked over an open fire. Technical advances in heating food in the 18th and 19th centuries changed the architecture of the kitchen. Before the advent of modern pipes, water was brought from an outdoor source such as wells, pumps or springs. Antiquity. The houses in ancient Greece were commonly of the atrium type. The rooms were arranged around a central courtyard for women. In many such homes, a covered but otherwise open patio served as the kitchen. Homes of the wealthy had the kitchen as a separate room, usually next to a bathroom, both rooms being accessible from the court. In such houses, there was often a separate small storage room in the back of the kitchen used for storing food and kitchen utensils. In the Roman Empire, common folk in cities often had no kitchen of their own. They did the cooking in large public kitchens. Some had small mobile bronze stoves, on which a fire could be lit for cooking. Wealthy Romans had relatively well-equipped kitchens. In a Roman villa, the kitchen was typically integrated into the main building as a separate room, set apart for practical reasons of smoke and sociological reasons of the kitchen being operated by slaves. The fireplace was typically on the floor, placed at a wall, sometimes raised a little bit, such that one had to kneel to cook. There were no chimneys. Middle Ages. Early medieval European longhouses had an open fire under the highest point of the building. The kitchen area was between the entrance and the fireplace. In wealthy homes there was typically more than one kitchen. In some homes there were upwards of 3 kitchens. The kitchens were divided based on the types of food prepared in them. In place of a chimney, these early buildings had a hole in the roof through which some of the smoke could escape. Besides cooking, the fire also served as a source of heat and light to the single-room building. A similar design can be found in the Iroquois longhouses of North America. In the larger homesteads of European nobles, the kitchen was sometimes in a separate sunken-floor building to keep the main building, which served social and official purposes, free from indoor smoke. The first known stoves in Japan date from about the same time. The earliest findings are from the Kofun period. These stoves, called kamado, were typically made of clay and mortar. They were fired with wood or charcoal through a hole in the front and had a hole in the top, into which a pot could be hanged by its rim. This type of stove remained in use for centuries to come, with only minor modifications. Like in Europe, the wealthier homes had a separate building which served for cooking. A kind of open fire pit, fired with charcoal, called iriri, remained in use as the secondary stove in most homes until the Edo period. A kamado was used to cook the staple food, for instance rice, while iriri served both to cook side side dishes and as a heat source. The kitchen remained largely unaffected by architectural advances throughout the Middle Ages. Open fire remained the only method of heating food. European medieval kitchens were dark, smoky, and sooty places, whence the name smoke kitchen. In European medieval cities around the 10th to 12th centuries, the kitchen still used an open fire hearth in the middle of the room. In wealthy homes, the ground floor was often used as a stable while the kitchen was located on the floor above, like the bedroom and the hall. In castles and monasteries, the living and working areas were separated. The kitchen was sometimes moved to a separate building, and thus could not serve any more to heat the living rooms. In some castles the kitchen was retained in the same structure, but servants were strictly separated from nobles by constructing separate spiral stone staircases for use of servants to bring food to upper levels. An extant example of such a medieval kitchen with servants' staircase is at Macnell's Castle in Scotland. In Japanese homes, the kitchen started to become a separate room within the main building at the time. With the advent of the chimney, the hearth moved from the center of the room to one wall, and the first brick-and-mortar hearths were built. The fire was lit on top of the construction. A vault underneath served to store wood. Pots made of iron, bronze, or copper started to replace the pottery used earlier. The temperature was controlled by hanging the pot higher or lower over the fire, or placing it on a trivet directly on the hot ashes. Using open fire for cooking was risky. Fires devastating whole cities occurred frequently. Leonardo da Vinci invented an automated system for a rotating spit for spit roasting. A propeller in the chimney made the spit turn all by itself. This kind of system was widely used in wealthier homes. Beginning in the late Middle Ages, kitchens in Europe lost the home heating function even more and were increasingly moved from the living area into a separate room. The living room was now heated by tiled stoves, operated from the kitchen, which offered the huge advantage of not filling the room with smoke. Freed from smoke and dirt, the living room thus began to serve as an area for social functions and increasingly became a showcase for the owner's wealth. In the upper classes, cooking and the kitchen were the domain of the servants, and the kitchen was set apart from the living rooms, sometimes even far from the dining room. Poorer homes often did not have a separate kitchen, yet they kept the one-room arrangement where all activities took place, or at the most had the kitchen in the entrance hall. The medieval smoke kitchen remained common, especially in rural farmhouses and generally in poorer homes, until much later. In a few European farmhouses, the smoke kitchen was in regular use until the middle of the 20th century. These houses often had no chimney, but only a smoke hood above the fireplace, made of wood and covered with clay, used to smoke meat. The smoke rose more or less freely, warming the upstairs rooms and protecting the woodwork from vermin. Colonial America in Connecticut, as in other colonies of New England during colonial America, kitchens were often built as separate rooms and were located behind the parlor and keeping room or dining room. One early record of a kitchen is found in the 1648 inventory of the estate of a John Porter of Windsor, Connecticut. The inventory lists goods in the house over the kitchen and in the kitchen. The items listed in the kitchen were silver spoons, pewter, brass, iron, arms, ammunition, hemp, flax and other implements about the room. Separate summer kitchens were also common on large farms in the north. These were used to prepare meals for harvest workers and tasks such as canning during the warm summer months. In the southern states, where the climate and sociological conditions differed from the north, the kitchen was often relegated to an outbuilding building. On plantations, it was separate from the big house or mansion in much the same way as the feudal kitchen in medieval Europe. The kitchen was operated by slaves, and the working place had to be separated from the living area of the masters by the social standards of the time. Technological advances during industrialization brought major changes to the kitchen. Iron stoves, which enclosed the fire completely and were more efficient, appeared. Early models included the Franklin stove around 1740, which was a furnace stove intended for heating, not for cooking. Benjamin Thompson in England designed his Rumford stove around 1800. This stove was much more energy efficient than earlier stoves. It used one fire to heat several pots, which were hung into holes on top of the stove and were thus heated from all sides instead of just from the bottom. However, his stove was designed for large kitchens. It was too big for domestic use. The Oberlin stove was a refinement of the technique that resulted in a size reduction. It was patented in the U.S. in 1834 and became a commercial success with some 90,000 units sold over the next 30 years. These stoves were still fired with wood or coal, although the first gas street lamps were installed in Paris, London, and Berlin at the beginning of the 1820s, and the first U.S. patent on a gas stove was granted in 1825. It was not until the late 19th century that using gas for lighting and cooking became commonplace in urban areas. Before and after the beginning of the 20th century, kitchens were frequently not equipped with built-in cabinetry, and the lack of storage space in the kitchen became a real problem. The Hoosier Manufacturing Co. of Indiana adapted an existing furniture piece, the baker's cabinet, which had a similar structure of a tabletop with some cabinets above it to solve the storage problem. By rearranging the parts and taking advantage of modern metalworking, they were able to produce a well-organized, compact cabinet which answered the home cook's needs for storage and working space. A distinctive feature of the Hoosier cabinet is its accessories. As originally supplied, they were equipped with various racks and other hardware to hold and organize spices and various staples. One useful feature was the combination flour bin sifter, a tin hopper that could be used without having to remove it from the cabinet. A similar sugar bin was also common. The urbanization in the second half of the 19th century induced other significant changes that would ultimately change the kitchen. Out of sheer necessity, cities began planning and building water distribution pipes into homes, and built sewers to deal with the wastewater. Gas pipes were laid. Gas was used first for lighting purposes, but once the network had grown sufficiently, it also became available for heating and cooking on gas stoves. At the turn of the 20th century, electricity had been mastered well enough to become a commercially viable alternative to gas and slowly started replacing the latter. But like the gas stove, the electric stove had a slow start. The first electrical stove had been presented in 1893 at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, but it was not until the 1930s that the technology was stable enough and began to take off. Industrialization also caused social changes. The new factory working class in the cities was housed under generally poor conditions. Whole families lived in small 1- or 2-room apartments in tenement buildings up to 6 stories high, badly aired and with insufficient lighting. Sometimes they shared apartments with night sleepers, unmarried men who paid for a bed at night. The kitchen in such an apartment was often used as a living and sleeping room, and even as a bathroom. Water had to be fetched from wells and heated on the stove. Water pipes were laid only towards the end of the 19th century, and then often only with one tap building up a story. Brick-and-mortar stoves fired with coal remained the norm until well into the second half of the century. Pots and kitchenware were typically stored on open shelves, and parts of the room could be separated from the rest using simple curtains. In contrast, there were no dramatic changes for the upper classes. The kitchen, located in the basement of the ground floor, continued to be operated by servants. In some houses, water pumps were installed, and some even had kitchen sinks and drains. The kitchen became a much cleaner space with the advent of cooking machines. Closed stoves made of iron plates and fired by wood and increasingly charcoal or coal, and that had flue pipes connected to the chimney. For the servants, the kitchen continued to also serve as a sleeping room. They slept either on the floor, or later in narrow spaces above a lowered ceiling, for the new stoves with the smoke outlet no longer required a high ceiling in the kitchen. The kitchen floors were tiled. Kitchenware was neatly stored in cupboards to protect them from dust and steam. A large table served as a workbench. There were at least as many chairs as there were servants. The table in the kitchen also doubled as the eating place for the servants. World War II cooking and dining trends. The urban middle class imitated the luxurious dining styles of the upper class as best as they could. Living in smaller apartments, the kitchen was the main room. Here, the family lived. The study or living room was saved for special occasions such as an occasional dinner invitation. Because of this, these middle-class kitchens were often more homely than those of the upper class, where the kitchen was a work-only room occupied only by the servants. Besides a cupboard to store the kitchenware, there were a table and chairs, where the family would dine, and sometimes, if space allowed, even a fauteuil or a couch. Gas pipes were first laid in the late 19th century, and gas stoves started to replace the older coal-fired stoves. Gas was more expensive than coal, though, and thus the new technology was first installed in the wealthier homes, where workers' apartments were equipped with a gas stove. Gas distribution would go through a coin meter. In rural areas, the older technology using coal or wood stoves or even brick-and-mortar open fireplaces remained common throughout. Gas and water pipes were first installed in the big cities. Small villages were connected only much later. Rationalization. The trend to increasing gasification and electrification continued at the turn of the 20th century. In industry, it was the phase of work process optimization. Taylorism was born, and time-motion studies were used to optimize processes. These ideas also spilled over into domestic kitchen architecture because of the growing trend that called for a professionalization of household work. Started in the mid-19th century by Catherine Beecher and amplified by Christine Frederick's publications in the 1910s. A stepstone was the kitchen designed in Frankfurt by Margareta Szydlewski. Working-class women frequently worked in factories to ensure the family's survival, as the men's wages often did not suffice. Social housing projects led to the next milestone, the Frankfurt kitchen. Developed in 1926, this kitchen measured 1.9 meters by 3.4 meters. It was built for two purposes: to optimize kitchen work, to reduce cooking time and lower the cost of building decently equipped kitchens. The design, created by Margareta Szydlewski, was the result of detailed time-motion studies and interviews with future tenants to identify what they needed from the kitchens. Szydlewski's fitted kitchen was built in some 10,000 apartments in the housing projects erected in Frankfurt in the 1930s. The initial reception was critical. It was so small that only one person could work in it. Some storage spaces intended for raw loose food ingredients such as flour were reachable by children. but the Frankfurt kitchen embodied a standard for the rest of the 20th century in rental apartments, the work kitchen. It was criticized as exiling the women in the kitchen, but post-World War II economic reasons prevail. The kitchen once more was seen as a workplace that needed to be separated from the living areas. Practical reasons also played a role in this development, just as in the bourgeois homes of the past. One reason for separating the kitchen was to keep the steam and smells of cooking out of the living room. Unit fitted. The idea of standardized was first introduced locally with the Frankfurt kitchen, but later defined new in the Swedish kitchen. The equipment used remained a standard for years to come: hot and cold water on tap, and a kitchen sink, and an electrical or gas stove, and oven. Not much later, the refrigerator was added as a standard item. The concept was refined in the Swedish kitchen, using unit furniture with wooden fronts for the kitchen cabinets. Soon, the concept was amended by the use of smooth synthetic door and drawer fronts, first in white, recalling a sense of cleanliness and alluding to sterile lab or hospital settings, but soon after in more lively colors, too. Some years after the Frankfurt kitchen, Poggenpol presented the Reform kitchen in 1928 with interconnecting cabinets and functional interiors. The Reform kitchen was a forerunner to the later unit kitchen and fitted kitchen. Unit construction since its introduction has defined the development of the modern kitchen. Pre-manufactured modules, using mass manufacturing techniques developed during World War II, greatly brought down the cost of a kitchen. Units which are kept on the floor are called floor units, floor cabinets, or base cabinets on which a kitchen worktop, originally often formica and often now made of granite, marble, tile or wood, is placed. The units which are held on the wall for storage purposes are termed as wall units, or wall cabinets. In small areas of kitchen in an apartment, even a tall storage unit is available for effective storage. In cheaper brands, all cabinets are kept a uniform color, normally white, with interchangeable doors and accessories chosen by the customer to give a varied look. In more expensive brands, the cabinets are produced matching the doors' colors and finishes, for an older, more bespoke look. Open kitchens. Starting in the 1980s, the perfection of the extractor hood allowed an open kitchen again, integrated more or less with the living room without causing the whole apartment or house to smell. Before that, only a few earlier experiments, typically in newly built upper-middle-class family homes, had open kitchens. Examples are Frank Lloyd Wright's House Willie and House Jacobs. Both had open kitchens, with high ceilings and were aired by skylights. The extractor hood made it possible to build open kitchens in apartments, too, where both high ceilings and skylights were not possible. The reintegration of the kitchen and the living area went hand in hand with a change in the perception of cooking. Increasingly, cooking was seen as a creative and sometimes social act instead of work, and there was a rejection by younger homeowners of the standard suburban model of separate kitchens and dining rooms found in most 1900 to 1950 houses. Many families also appreciated the trend towards open kitchens, as it made it easier for the parents to supervise the children while cooking and to clean up spills. The enhanced status of cooking also made the kitchen a prestige object for showing off one's wealth or cooking professionalism. Some architects have capitalized on this object aspect of the kitchen by designing freestanding kitchen objects. However, like the precursor Kalani's kitchen satellite, such futuristic designs are exceptions. Another reason for the trend back to open kitchens is changes in how food is prepared. Whereas prior to the 1950s most cooking started out with raw ingredients and a meal had to be prepared prepared from scratch. The advent of frozen meals and pre-prepared convenience food changed the cooking habits of many people, who consequently used the kitchen less and less. For others, who followed the cooking as a social act trend, the opened kitchen had the advantage that they could be with the guests while cooking, and for the creative cooks, it might even become a stage for the cooking performance. The trophy kitchen is equipped with very expensive and sophisticated appliances which are used primarily to impress visitors and to project social status, rather than for actual cooking. Ventilation. The ventilation of a kitchen, in particular a large restaurant kitchen, poses certain difficulties that are not present in the ventilation of other kinds of spaces. In particular, the air in a kitchen differs from that of other rooms in that it typically contains grease, smoke and odors. Materials. The Frankfurt kitchen of 1926 was made of several materials depending on the application. The built-in kitchens of today use particle boards or MDF, decorated with veneers, in some cases also wood. Very few manufacturers produce home built-in kitchens from stainless steel. Until the 1950s, steel kitchens were used by architects, but this material was displaced by the cheaper particle board panels, sometimes decorated with a steel surface.